In the spring of 1965, a man stood blindfolded on a wooden platform in the center of Marjah Square in Damascus, a thick rope already tightened around his neck, while thousands of Syrians gathered below to watch what their government called the execution of the century's most dangerous spy. But what none of them knew, what even the Syrian president himself had struggled to believe when the evidence first landed on his desk, was that this man had once sat across from him at private dinners, had whispered advice into the ears of generals, had toured every secret military fortification along the Golan Heights, and had come within inches of being appointed Syria's next deputy minister of defense. His name was Eli Cohen, and for nearly 4 years he had lived a double life so extraordinary, so deeply embedded in the highest corridors of Syrian power, that when the truth finally surfaced, it sent tremors through every intelligence agency on Earth. The story of how he got there, how he pulled it off, and the single catastrophic mistake that brought it all crashing down, is one of the Cold War's most gripping and heartbreaking chapters. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe, because this channel dives deep into the hidden stories that most history books skip over. The making of a ghost. To understand how one man fooled an entire nation, you have to go back to where it all began. Eli Cohen was born on December 26, 1924, in Alexandria, Egypt, to a family of Syrian Jewish descent. His parents had left Aleppo a decade earlier, settling in the bustling port city where Jewish, Muslim, and Christian communities lived side by side in an uneasy but functional coexistence. Young Eli was deeply religious and had once dreamed of becoming a rabbi. But the city's yeshiva closed down, and his path shifted toward Cairo University, where he studied electronics and engineering. It was during those years that something else awakened in him. He became a committed Zionist, and in a country where such sympathies could land a man in prison, that was a dangerous thing to be. In 1949, after the creation of the State of Israel, Cohen's parents and 3 brothers packed up and emigrated. But Eli stayed behind. He stayed because Israeli intelligence needed people on the ground in Egypt, people who spoke fluent Arabic, who understood the culture from the inside, who could move through crowds without drawing a second glance. Throughout the early 1950s, Cohen helped coordinate the secret emigration of Egyptian Jews to Israel, a perilous operation that required forged documents, hidden safe houses, and nerves of absolute steel. He was arrested at least once by Egyptian authorities and questioned about his Zionist activities, but they could never pin enough evidence on him to press charges. He was released, watched, and released again. By 1956, after the Suez Crisis, the Egyptian government expelled most of the remaining Jewish population, and Cohen finally made his way to Israel, carrying with him years of clandestine experience and a fluency in deception that would soon catch the attention of people far more powerful than he could have imagined. But the Mossad, Israel's legendary intelligence agency, did not come calling right away. And the reason for that delay would set the stage for one of the most audacious recruitment stories in espionage history. The recruitment. When Cohen arrived in Israel, the reception was far from what he had hoped. He applied to the Mossad and was rejected. The agency's recruiters did not see anything extraordinary in the quiet Egyptian immigrant with the thick glasses and the modest demeanor. He was assigned to a low-level military intelligence desk job, analyzing reports and filing paperwork. The man who had dodged Egyptian secret police was now sitting in a windowless office in Tel Aviv, shuffling documents. He eventually left altogether and took a job at an insurance company. He married a beautiful Iraqi-born woman named Nadia in 1959, and for a brief moment it seemed like the spy who never was had simply faded into quiet domesticity. But the Mossad had not forgotten about him. In 1960, a senior intelligence officer reviewed Cohen's file and saw what earlier recruiters had missed. A native Arabic speaker, fluent in French, English, and Hebrew, with years of real operational experience in hostile territory. More importantly, Israel had a growing problem on its northern border. Syria was shelling Israeli farms from the fortified Golan Heights, and Israeli intelligence had almost no reliable human sources inside the Syrian government. They needed someone inside Damascus. Eli Cohen was brought in for a meeting, and this time the Mossad did not let him walk away. He was given 6 months of intensive training in espionage tradecraft, coded radio transmission, and the art of building a cover identity so deep that even the man living it would sometimes forget where the fiction ended and the truth began. The identity they created for him was nothing short of a masterpiece. Kamel Amin Thaabet. The Mossad did not simply hand Cohen a fake passport and send him to Damascus. Instead, they built an entirely new person from the ground up, a man named Kamel Amin Thaabet, supposedly born in Beirut to wealthy Syrian parents who had emigrated to Argentina. Thaabet was a successful businessman who had made his fortune in Buenos Aires but yearned to return to the homeland of his ancestors. He was charming, generous, passionate about Arab nationalism, and eager to contribute to Syria's future. Every detail was crafted to appeal to exactly the kind of people Cohen would need to befriend. But first, he had to make the legend real. In early 1961, Cohen flew to Buenos Aires under his new identity and began embedding himself in the Syrian expatriate community. And this is where his natural talent became unmistakable. Within months, Kamel Amin Thaabet was one of the most popular figures in the Argentine-Syrian social scene. He hosted lavish dinners, attended embassy functions, and cultivated friendships with some of the most influential Syrians living abroad. Among them was a military officer named Amin al-Hafez, who served as Syria's military attaché in Argentina. The two men became close, bonding over shared meals and long conversations about politics. Cohen could not have known it at the time, but this friendship would prove to be the most consequential relationship of his entire mission, because Amin al-Hafez was about to become the president of Syria. After spending roughly a year building his cover, Cohen made his move. He told his new friends that he was finally going home, back to Damascus, to invest his fortune in the motherland. They showered him with introductions and letters of recommendation. In January of 1962, Eli Cohen stepped off a plane in Damascus as Kamel Amin Thaabet, and the most dangerous chapter of his life began. Inside the regime asterisk. Damascus in the early 1960s was a city of whispers, conspiracies, and constant political upheaval. Military coups were practically seasonal events. Governments rose and fell with alarming speed, and the men who held power today could be in prison or exile by tomorrow. For a spy, this kind of chaos was both an opportunity and a death trap. One wrong word, one misplaced trust, and the consequences were swift and final. But Eli Cohen thrived in this environment in a way that astonished even his own handlers back in Tel Aviv. He rented a luxurious apartment in the upscale Abu Rumeineh neighborhood, just a short distance from the Syrian Army General Staff headquarters, and he began doing what he did best, making friends. Cohen understood something fundamental about human nature that many intelligence agencies still struggle to teach. People do not give up their secrets because they are tricked or threatened. They give them up because they trust someone, because they feel comfortable, because they are in a room where the drinks are flowing, and the man sitting across from them seems genuinely interested in what they have to say. Cohen became that man. His apartment became one of the most sought-after social venues in Damascus. He threw legendary parties filled with expensive liquor and beautiful women, evenings where generals and cabinet ministers let their guard down completely. High-ranking officials would casually discuss troop deployments, weapons shipments, and classified military strategy over glasses of whiskey. Cohen would pretend to drink heavily himself, stumbling and laughing, while in reality he was memorizing every word. He lent money to politicians who were short on cash, offered business advice to military officers, and became the man everyone in Damascus wanted to know. Then in March of 1963, something extraordinary happened that elevated Cohen's position beyond anything the Mossad had planned for. A military coup brought the Ba'ath Party to power in Syria, and among the new ruling elite were several men that Cohen had befriended in Argentina. His old friend Amin al-Hafez rose through the ranks with breathtaking speed, eventually becoming the president of Syria. Suddenly, Kamel Amin Thaabet was not just a wealthy businessman with good connections. He was a personal friend of the head of state. Doors that had been merely opened before were now flung wide. Cohen received classified military briefings. He attended closed government sessions where national security policy was debated. He was consulted on matters of state by ministers who valued his opinion. And most critically of all, he was granted something that no civilian, and certainly no foreign agent, had ever been given before: a personal guided tour of Syria's most closely guarded military secret. The Golan Heights. The Golan Heights in the early 1960s was a fortress. Perched high above the Sea of Galilee and the farming communities of northern Israel, this volcanic plateau had been transformed by the Syrian military into a dense network of bunkers, artillery positions, and fortified observation posts. From these heights, Syrian gunners regularly shelled Israeli villages below, killing farmers and terrorizing communities that lived in constant fear. For Israeli military planners, the Golan was a nightmare. They knew any future war with Syria would require taking these heights, but they had almost no reliable intelligence about the fortifications. And then Eli Cohen walked right through the front door. Using his connections with senior military officers, Cohen managed to arrange what amounted to a comprehensive VIP tour of the entire Golan Heights defense network. He visited bunker after bunker, fortification after fortification, accompanied by officers who proudly showed off their preparations and posed for photographs with their charming civilian friend. Cohen took mental notes of everything: the locations of gun emplacements, the angles of fire, the positions of tank traps, the layout of minefields, the supply routes, and the command structures that connected them all. He sketched detailed maps from memory and transmitted them back to Tel Aviv through his hidden radio. But his most brilliant move was yet to come. During his tour, Cohen casually remarked to his military escorts that the soldiers stationed on the heights looked miserable, baking under the relentless sun with no shade to speak of. He suggested, as a patriotic gesture, that eucalyptus trees be planted around each fortified position to provide relief for the troops. The officers thought it was a wonderful idea, and the order was given. Rows of tall eucalyptus trees soon appeared at every major Syrian military position along the Golan Heights, standing like green flags on an otherwise barren landscape. 2 years later, when Israeli forces finally stormed those heights during the Six-Day War, they would use those trees as targeting markers, pinpointing the exact locations of Syrian fortifications from miles away. The Golan Heights fell in just 2 days, a military achievement that stunned the world, and much of the credit belongs to the intelligence that one man had gathered while pretending to care about the comfort of enemy soldiers. But Cohen's contributions went far beyond the eucalyptus trees. He also uncovered a secret Syrian plan to create 3 successive defensive lines of bunkers and mortars on the heights, information that was critical because Israeli planners had only expected to encounter a single line of resistance. He discovered and reported on Syria's scheme to divert the headwaters of the Jordan River, a project that would have devastated Israel's water supply. Israeli forces used his intelligence to destroy the diversion equipment before the plan could be carried out. He provided lists of Syrian pilots and detailed sketches of the weapons mounted on their warplanes. He transmitted the names of Syrian intelligence operatives working abroad. The sheer volume and quality of the information flowing from Cohen's radio was unlike anything the Mossad had ever received from a single source. And back in Tel Aviv, the analysts who processed his transmissions began to realize that they had something truly extraordinary on their hands. The cracks begin to show asterisk. But even the most perfect cover eventually begins to fray, and by late 1963, the first warning signs appeared. After yet another internal power struggle within the Syrian government, a new intelligence chief was appointed, a man named Colonel Ahmed Suidani. Unlike the officers who had come before him, Suidani was suspicious, methodical, and deeply paranoid about foreign infiltration. He did not like or trust many of the figures who had risen to prominence during the previous regime, and Kamel Amin Thaabet was among those who caught his cold, watchful eye. There was nothing specific, no evidence, no accusation, just a feeling, an instinct that something about this wealthy businessman did not quite add up. Cohen sensed the shift immediately. The warmth that had once greeted him at government functions began to cool ever so slightly. Questions that had once been casual now carried an edge. He reported his concerns to his handlers in Tel Aviv, and in November of 1964, during what would be his final secret visit to Israel, he told them plainly that he wanted to end the mission. He had come home to witness the birth of his third child, and as he held his newborn daughter, the weight of what he was doing, the double life, the constant danger, the years of separation from his family, pressed down on him with a force he could no longer ignore. But the Mossad was not ready to let him go. The intelligence he was providing was too valuable, too irreplaceable. They asked him to return to Syria just one more time. Cohen agreed, but before he left, he made a promise to his wife Nadia that this trip would be his last, that he would come home for good, and they would finally live the normal life they had always dreamed of. He kissed his children goodbye and flew back to Damascus, not knowing that he had just seen his family for the last time. The trap. In January of 1965, Syrian intelligence, now working closely with Soviet electronic surveillance experts, launched a systematic effort to locate a suspected high-level spy. They had known for some time that someone was transmitting coded radio signals from within Damascus, but they had been unable to pinpoint the source. The Soviets provided advanced radio direction finding equipment, and the Syrians implemented a clever tactic. They imposed deliberate periods of radio silence across the country, shutting down official transmissions at specific times so that any unauthorized signal would stand out like a flashlight in a dark room. Cohen had been warned repeatedly by his handlers to vary the timing and duration of his transmissions, to never broadcast at the same time 2 days in a row, to keep his messages short and unpredictable. But the pressure of his double life, the sheer volume of intelligence he was gathering, and perhaps a growing sense that time was running out, led him to take risks that he had always avoided before. He began transmitting at roughly the same time each day, and the signals were getting longer. On January 24, 1965, the net finally closed. Syrian security forces, guided by Soviet tracking equipment, traced an unauthorized radio transmission to a residential building in Abu Rummaneh. They broke down the door of an apartment and found Eli Cohen sitting at his desk, his hand still on the transmitter, mid-broadcast to Tel Aviv. The room fell silent. For a long, terrible moment, Cohen and the Syrian officers simply stared at each other, both sides understanding with perfect clarity what had just happened and what it meant. The most productive spy in Israeli history had been caught. The trial and the world's plea asterisk. What followed was a nightmare that played out on the international stage. Cohen was subjected to weeks of intense interrogation. The specifics of what happened in those rooms have never been fully disclosed, but accounts suggest the methods were brutal. Despite everything, Cohen reportedly revealed very little of operational value, protecting his sources even as the walls closed in. He was put on trial before a military tribunal in a proceeding that most international observers considered a show trial, designed to humiliate Israel on the world stage. When news of his capture broke, a massive campaign for clemency was launched. World leaders, the Pope, and international organizations all appealed to Syria to spare his life. His wife Nadia wrote desperate letters to President Amin al-Hafez, the very man who had once considered her husband a trusted friend, begging for mercy. None of it made any difference. On May 18, 1965, Eli Cohen was publicly hanged in Marjah Square in Damascus. His body was left hanging for 6 hours, draped in a placard covered with anti-Zionist slogans, while Syrian state television broadcast the scene. He was 40 years old. 3 days before his execution, Cohen had written a final letter to his wife. In it, he had asked her not to waste her life mourning something that was already done, to focus on the future and raise their children with strength and hope. Those words, written in the shadow of death by a man who had sacrificed everything, remain one of the most heartbreaking documents in the history of modern espionage. The legacy that won a war. Eli Cohen was dead, but the intelligence he had gathered lived on. 2 years after his execution, in June of 1967, Israel found itself surrounded by hostile Arab armies. When the Six-Day War erupted, the battle for the Golan Heights became one of the conflict's defining moments. Israeli commanders charged up those steep volcanic slopes with a level of confidence and precision that shocked the world. They knew where the bunkers were. They knew where the minefields were. They knew about the 3 lines of defense instead of 1. And they could see the eucalyptus trees, standing tall and green against the barren hillsides, marking every Syrian position like signposts on a highway. The Golan Heights fell in 48 hours, a feat that military historians still regard as one of the most remarkable achievements of the 20th century. The capture of those heights fundamentally changed the strategic landscape of the Middle East, removing the threat of Syrian artillery from northern Israel. And behind that victory was the ghost of a man who had been dead for 2 years but whose work had made it all possible. The search that never ended. In the decades since his execution, Israel has never stopped trying to bring Eli Cohen home. His body was never returned, and its exact location remains unknown, buried somewhere in Syria in a grave that the Assad regime refused to identify for over half a century. Successive Israeli governments made the recovery of his remains a priority, conducting quiet diplomatic efforts and covert operations aimed at locating his burial site. Then, in May of 2025, on the 60th anniversary of his execution, the Israeli government made a stunning announcement. In a covert operation inside Syria, the Mossad had recovered approximately 2,500 documents and personal items from the Syrian intelligence archive on Eli Cohen. The collection included handwritten letters to his family, photographs from his time undercover. His original will written hours before he was hanged, and the keys to his Damascus apartment. Among them was a thick orange folder labeled with his wife's name, containing surveillance records showing the Syrian regime had monitored Nadia Cohen for years, tracking her letters to world leaders and her campaign to bring her husband home. The materials were presented to Nadia in a ceremony attended by the Prime Minister and the Mossad director, 60 years after she had watched her husband leave for the last time. But his body has still not been found. The Mossad has stated publicly that the search is an ongoing mission, one that will not end until he is brought home. In the Golan Heights, a 70-kilometer memorial trail now bears his name, winding through the very fortifications he once mapped. At one point along the trail, there is a sculpture of his face with 4 sides, each looking in a different direction, toward Israel, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. When his face looks toward Israel, his lips are open. When it faces Syria, they are sealed shut. The eucalyptus trees he planted are still standing.